as mentioned earlier, the topic of this second discussion is what should be the ambition moving forward at future COP summits. I'm delighted that this panel will be chaired by the Mayor of West Yorkshire, Tracy Braben, a former colleague of mine in the House who's gone on to greater things and is a committed supporter of net zero. And I'm delighted to actually announce that I'll be sort of partnering with Mayor Braben on a new power generation network report that's going to bring the renewable industry, the nuclear industry, the grid and infrastructure industries of the UK together to look at how we can focus on delivering what was actually the #1 mission in my net zero review, which is around how do we achieve the grid and infrastructure that's needed to be able to build out the capacity for clean and renewable power. So I'm delighted that Tracy's able to join us today to moderate this session. I'd also like to invite the panellists to the stage. They include the Right Honourable Lord Goldsmith of Richmond Park, another colleague of mine in government who's long been committed to the energy transition and to the environment. Her Excellency, the High Commissioner of Bangladesh, His Excellency, the Ambassador to Azerbaijan, as mentioned, are now going to be the hosts of COP29. And also finally, Dr. Helen Adams, a Senior Lecturer in Disaster Risk Reduction and Climate Change Adaptation at King's College London. So Tracy, if I can hand over to you and the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If our colleagues could take a seat, I'll pop in the middle, if I may. Good stuff. Thank you, and thank you so much, distinguished guests and your excellencies. What an absolute pleasure to be here today, and also to be joining Chris Skidmore as co-chair of Mission Zero Coalition. It's a great opportunity for us to work together and for mayors to help deliver against the climate emergency. So, what we're going to be discussing today is following on from the previous panel, what happened at COP28. We're now going to move on to what should the future ambition for COP be. And I am delighted and humbled by the quality of guests here this afternoon. Before we move on just to hear from our guests, I just wanted to speak for a couple of minutes about what it means to be a mayor. I am the Mayor of West Yorkshire, which is a region of 2.8 million people. Big cities in my region, Leeds and Bradford. It has 7 universities, 9 further education colleges, and is a vibrant community. It has more manufacturing jobs than anywhere else in the north. So we were the home of the Industrial Revolution, and I hope that we are also the solution to the climate emergency. And I remember hearing the Mayor of New York saying that actually mayors are the tugboats that are pushing the tankers of government into the right position because we have power and money. And in the UK, there are 10 metro mayors. Sadly, there's only 1 woman metro mayor, so we definitely need to address that challenge. But as the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said at COP28, mayors should demand a seat at the table. We are playing a key role in combating the climate emergency. And we know, don't we, that cities are responsible for 70% of global emissions. But Climate Change Commission estimates 1/3 of emissions are in control of local leaders. We have the mandate to have that just and fair transition to a net zero future, because 1 in 5 jobs will disappear in my region because it's manufacturing, and there's going to be 6.3 million people across the UK that need that retraining. So we're going to be throwing our full political support behind the renewables revolution. And the reason why I think mayors are part of the solution is because when the public are asked who do they trust in politics, Sadly, MPs and peers, sorry, Zach, are at the bottom, and mayors and local leaders are are at the top and very, very trusted. And we can use creativity and data and also the power and money that comes with devolution. In West Yorkshire, I've only been the mayor for 2.5 years, but we have brought in £2.8 billion worth of investment into our region through devolution. And we have responsibilities over housing, transport, economy, skills, and climate. And in every single one of those responsibilities, I have taken action to tackle the climate emergency, to hit our zero carbon emissions target of 2038. And let's not forget, government is 2050. So we are acting at speed in transport, whether that's developing mass transit, whether that's bringing in the mayor's fare, a cheaper fare, so people use buses, whether that's working on a better homes hub, mass retrofit, loans for homeowners who want to retrofit their homes, skills, 1,000 green jobs for young people was one of my manifesto pledges. We've exceeded that target. There are many items that I can deliver at speed. And of course, my climate and environment plan, £40 million has been allocated for that plan. To do it properly, I need 4.4 billion, but we have to start somewhere. So on that note, I'm going to take a pew and I'm going to ask our very honoured guests to speak for about 5 minutes about their vision for the future. And then I will definitely open it up to the audience. So I really hope we can have a good, robust discussion full of ideas and possibilities for the next phase beyond this COP. So thank you all so much. I'll take a pew and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okie dokie. So as we're talking about the future, I wonder whether His Excellency Ellen Suleimanov would like to open it up about what you've taken from COP and then what you're looking at moving forwards for the hosting of COP next year in Azerbaijan, which I hope we will all be at. And what's the benefits for your country taking this leadership role?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. It's a pleasure to be at this distinguished panel. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and I want to thank especially the King's College, our colleagues from Net Zero Coalition, Policy Institute, and of course our good friends from the Diplomat for making this possible. Thank you very much. Madam Mayor, we have something in common with your city because Azerbaijan was the home of the first energy boom, first oil boom in the beginning of the 20th century, as Baku produced 50% of the global oil supply in 1910. So we're very hopeful that today, when we're transitioning to the green energy and the green transition is taking place in the region, Azerbaijan is already taking the lead, but we hope that COP29 will highlight and emphasize it and accelerate the transition. We take a very regional view. First of all, I want to thank our good friends at UAE because they've done a fantastic work, both logistically, but also bringing people together, trying to. And I know I heard some people said, "Look, I mean, it's not good enough." The protocol, it will never be good enough. For, by the end of the day, when you bring a very wide coalition of people and want to make it implementable, you understand that to make sure that it applies to everybody, it has to have some compromise decisions. But our ability of our colleagues at UAE to make it happen is very uniquely important, I think, and we should appreciate that. And we take lessons from them. I think that's important, as well as taking lessons from COP26 here when we were also present in Glasgow. One thing which made this particular decision in UAE to choose Azerbaijan as a president for COP29 is a very specific issue, which I don't know how much it was widely covered. For the Eastern and Central European group to nominate Azerbaijan as a presidency and as a host for the future COP29, it had to have no objection. It had to be a consensus decision, which meant that Armenia, our neighbor, with which we've been engaged with for 30 years conflict, had to agree. And as a matter of fact, for the first time since the independence of both Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Office of the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan and the Office of the Prime Minister of the Republic of Armenia together issued a joint statement in which Armenia graciously supported Azerbaijan's bid to host COP29. We supported their candidacy for the Bureau of COP, Eastern European Group, and we reiterated our joint commitment to finding a peace agreement as soon as possible and normalize the relationship. Now, this is a very important issue because our officers, two of them, the highest officers in the countries, never made a joint statement ever before. They made a joint statement supported by EU, maybe by Russia, by the United States, but they never just on their own, as a result of direct bilateral conversation, have done that. That's a very important contribution. So what you see is effort to produce a cleaner world already produces more peaceful world. I think that's very important. And there's a very important element to this as well, additional, that is after COP26, there were serious commitments and serious hopes to reduce coal pollution, to move forward with a reduction of the fossil fuel consumption. But we've seen so many conflicts flaring up. We saw the conflict between, we saw the situation between Russia and Ukraine, others, where both because of political issues, people had to go back on their commitments, but also simply the simple pollution from the fighting in the area produced enormous carbon footprint. So not only the environmental issues, but political issues bringing peace and a reduction of conflict by itself is already a good thing for the environment. And I think this should not be underestimated. So I think we're in a good position. We're very hopeful. Azerbaijan is, as an oil and gas producing country, is moving very much forward with green energy. We have actually began exporting. We generate power from wind and solar. We made major commitments to increase our production of green energy. In fact, the area which was liberated in 2020 at the end of the conflict with Armenia will be all net zero. It's not an easy thing to do, but we're trying to work on this. There are already net zero offsetting schemes for our oil production and gas production areas where the power supply to the rigs is either wind or solar generated. And together with our wonderful friends from Georgia, and I know Georgian ambassador was here, she promised to watch our panel online, so I hope she does. We work very closely on building undersea electricity cable in the Black Sea, in which we will now deliver to the Eastern Europe, to countries such as Bulgaria and Hungary and Serbia, not just oil, not just gas as it used to be, but also electricity produced from clean renewable sources, such as wind and solar. So I think it's a very good trajectory, but it needs to be supported. Now, one thing I wanted to say, and I don't want to take much of your time, we spoke about damage and loss, remedial measures, but I think even more important is technology transfer and ability and availability of for developing nations to be able to access new technologies. I mean, for what we can talk a lot about this, but if you need to buy an electric car which is so expensive and it's so much cheaper to buy a diesel car which is very polluting, I mean, at the end of the day, people need to make decisions compared to according to their own demands and their own domestic priorities within every family. So I think technology transfer, availability of not just finances, but actually new industries, new production facilities within those countries is very important. As a mayor, if you have somewhere in the developing world a battery producing factory, an electric car producing factory, it would be much easier for people to use these vehicles to be a little bit more involved with the new production, with new energy sources than it would be if we sit here, let's say in London or somewhere in Europe, and look at the developing world and tell them, look, this is how it should be done. Yeah, everybody, at the end of the day, everybody knows how it should be done. It's not an issue that nobody wants to drive an electric car. It's quieter, it's nicer, it doesn't go as far, but still. But the question is it available? Is it affordable? Can you do it? And as a country which up until I think end of this year chairs the non-alignment movement, which is the second largest international organization after UN, Azerbaijan is the chair country of non-alignment movement since 2019, we have seen this kind of issues facing us. For instance, and I'll just step back and just use an example of vaccine distribution. Everybody talked about the need for vaccine. Everybody, our Western partners came up and said, everybody needs to be vaccinated. And then they grabbed all the vaccines and didn't let anybody have any. And that was a major issue for us at the NAM chairmanship, because it's everybody knows you need to get vaccinated, but if there's no vaccine, what do you do? So affordability over advanced technologies, affordability, access to not just financing, but also ability to produce and utilize that in daily lives of people. I think that's a key important. I think we will be working on this as well. Anyway, I don't want to take much of the time.
No, that was really
thank
interesting.
you.
And I think what a good news story about the collaboration and the fact that your mission to tackle a climate emergency has brought two traditional enemies together around the table to deliver. And I think your point about innovation and knowledge is really powerful as well, that you can't expect countries to do this on their own without the smarts and without the companies who are prepared to invest. So I think you make a really powerful point. And if I may come to Her Excellency, Sayeda Muna Tasnim, obviously collaboration is important, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how that's looking from your perspective.
Thank you very much. Well, let me congratulate you on your net zero by 2038.
Indeed.
Very commendable initiative, and mayors do matter. And I understand this time at the COP28, there was a meeting for the mayors. So I think mayors should be encouraged. And, speaking of my country, Dhaka city, it's now the second most densely populated cities in the world. And, we were discussing about ULAs and London City just before coming here, whether, it increases, because, the lanes are so small, whether it increases numbers of cars and long waits. So we need to have a balance, and Dhaka City has, I think, the largest, traffic jams. So coming back to, Bangladesh's perspective, Bangladesh was the LDC negotiator at the COP28, and therefore we speak the voice of climate vulnerables, and we were, during the COP26, the president of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is a forum of 56 countries, of most climatically vulnerable countries, and I know the High Commissioner of Barbados and Grenada is here, and I speak for all the climate, and Costa Rica, they're also a member of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. And therefore, at COP28, and what we expect in the future is that what was created in COP28 comes the Loss and Damage Fund, and, I think somebody spoke on it, but, the Loss and Damage Fund, again, if you need to focus more on how do you reduce vulnerability. You can't reduce vulnerability, but just by mitigation, because, that you still have the risk of natural disasters. So those countries that are continuously having natural disasters have already had losses. When the developed countries were emitting, these countries like Bangladesh, our carbon footprint is 0.45 metric ton, 0.45. It's as small as that. And yet, at COP21, we had pledged 3 times higher NDCs than Paris compared to 2015. In 6 years, we doubled in 2021. And, we will be probably going 3 times higher commitments for NDCs in the Brazil 2025. But what matters is, for climate vulnerable countries, is that we haven't received, we are disappointed still with COP28 because, the Loss and Damage Fund that has been created did receive a lot of, opposition. I don't want to name countries, but then at the end of the day, we saw that 770 million was collected, and, we congratulate UAE for giving 100 million, Germany for contributing 100 million, and some other countries had contributed. UK had just repledged what they had pledged in 2021. So, we expect new additional funding by UK. Now, what happens to this fund? Again, the headquarters has gone to World Bank, and World Bank will be heading it. And that, again, what we want to see in the future is that the global multilateral financing architecture, that needs to be restructured, if you ask me, because without that, we have seen the Green Climate Fund, for example, and I'm talking about financing here, and that's most important for CVF and what we want to see in the future, and also for LDCs. So speak of LDCs, SIDS, and another thing, Bangladesh is not a SIDS, but we are a sinking coastline country, and there is a category called sinking coastline country. Our coastline have 19 districts that the IPCC report says would be going underwater by 2070. And that means nearly 30 million people, because we are 180 million people. It's a very densely populated country. And all the coastal cities are under this risk of, about 25 to 30 million people become climatically displaced. So for the loss and damage is very important. Now, what loss and damage has been caused over the past 50 years, no one can, recover that for, small island countries or Bangladesh. But we can do, if we're looking into the future, then we need to have, the 26-member board of the Loss and Damage Fund at the World Bank. At least 50% or more should be from climate vulnerable countries. That's what we demand in the future. And that should be decided like that. We should have a big voice there, which we don't. And the other one is, the Santiago Network for the network, and I do pay my tributes to Dr. Salim ul Haq because, speaking today, he was the voice for loss and damage, and he really, really fought hard, but we lost him. But, his cause will not be lost. So the Santiago Network, we also didn't have a secretariat. So I've heard that the UNDRR has volunteered, and UNOPS, to have the secretariat, to be the secretariat for the Santiago Network. So this is how loss and damage was neglected. And even within the G77 in China, when it came to adaptation and loss and damage, there was a division. The LDCs and SIDS were on one side, and the developing countries, and I don't want to name, but G20 is responsible for 85% of global emissions. So our voice was very strong as to we want to see, for us, it's an existential threat. So we need to exist first. And for that, 1.5 degrees is sacrosanct for us, so we must not lose sight of the 1.5 degrees goal at any cost. And we already know from scientific reports that we have lost the cause. That means we have crossed 1.5 degrees. And on the front of mitigation, I want to say that, we have seen that at the COP28 that 43% of additional emissions cut have to be done by 2030 if we want to meet the decade goal. And currently, the developed countries are falling short of 7 times lesser because they need to meet 7 times higher indices, higher ambitious indices in the Brazil or in the Azerbaijan. So we want to see this much higher and ambitious indices without which you cannot actually keep to 1.5 degrees. We cannot allow 1.5 degrees. Even a temporary diversion is going to cause sea level rise, and it's going to, make countries like Bangladesh go underwater. So in terms of that, mitigation, that's what we want to see. And, there's this new mechanism for financing, which is the quantitative, the post-2025 finance and a new collective quantified goals on climate finance. That needs to be, if you look at the situation and the status of financing right now, 100 billion, we've never seen that. Bangladesh has a national adaptation plan. Our Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, she's put that plan in 2009, right after coming from Copenhagen. And there we already have 500 million of our own funds. Because when your country is going underwater, you can't wait for somebody else to come and give you money. You have to try to survive yourself. So this fund was created in 2009, 500 million for 850 projects, all of which are climate adaptation and resilience. We need to focus on climate resilience and how to build more climate resilience for climate vulnerables. And that fund, we have, this time at COP28, we have presented a national plan for adaptation, and it requires, every year we are spending $3 billion for climate adaptation and resilience, and also mitigation, but more focus is on adaptation because our carbon footprint is very less. But we need every year 8.5 billion. So we are short of 5.5 billion. And the global goals for adaptation and COP28, that's also very important. We're happy that there was a framework for global goals for adaptation. And it says that adaptation fund, each year, it will require 40 billion additional fundings. So where does it come from? So we need to focus on fundings. If you look at the Green Climate Fund, it has got 12.5 billion because it focuses on mitigation. But when it comes to LDC fund, it has only got additional pledges of about 180 million. It is so less. When it comes to loss and damage, it's got 770. So the funds for LDCs, the Special Climate Change Fund for developing countries and vulnerable countries, these are receiving much less funding than those on mitigation. The focus is so much on mitigation. But adaptation, you have set a net zero, and I want to thank Mission Zero Coalition for inviting me. But we have set a net zero for emissions. What about the net zero for adaptation? How much adaptation can we do? And for that, we need huge amounts of funding. So financing new innovative mechanisms and consensus on financing is very important, because we know that multilateral financial system is very difficult to restructure it. But what about new innovative? And I know that Net Zero Bankers was here. But there's so many philanthropies in Bangladesh. We are. I also want to say that few things that needs to happen between between now and COP29 and COP30 is we have to look into partnerships, and partnerships for example, my friend from Azerbaijan said that technologies. We cannot afford technologies. Bangladesh is a densely populated country. Every single acre has to be arable for agriculture. We need to ensure our food security. So where do we go? We go offshore. Offshore technologies are very, very expensive, and we don't have the means. So financing technology transfer and capacity building for climate vulnerable and developing countries, LDC says, is extremely important. So I'll stop here, but one more thing I want to add. We have, as a country that faces natural disasters every year, cyclones and floods, we have set up our own mechanisms for climate resilience. And we are doing nature-based solutions, and I think nature-based solutions is extremely important, something that should be looked into in COP29 and COP28. And if we can have a day dedicated to nature-based solutions, I'd be very happy. For us, we have a traditional floating agriculture. You can grow everything on a bed of water hyacinth. And that Bangladesh is doing it's a traditional system, and we are doing it in the coastal areas. The other one is we have invented salinity resilient rice varieties and drought resilient rice varieties. We have now developed flood resilient rice varieties. These are the things that we should be talking about in terms of adaptation and climate resilience. So I hope that COP29 and COP28, and congratulations to Azerbaijan, how two countries can unite for preventing climate change. This is an excellent example. We deserve a huge applaud for that. We should give him one. So at the end, one more thing, I would like to say that, developing country, if you look at the Commonwealth, and Mr. Goldsmith is here, former Minister for Commonwealth, we have 2.4 billion people in the Commonwealth. And, 65% of those people are young people. And I think he spoke about the youth. Somebody was speaking about the youth voices. We need to have at least one youth conference, before the COP29 or maybe at the sidelines of the COP. But our young people, our coastal youth have prepared a coastal youth network. And that network is so strong. They are the voices of the local communities and the youth leaders. They know exactly what's going on in their fields, in the agricultural sector, in the shrimp cultivation. Their voice is very strong. And I'm talking about gender as well, being the president of the Women in Diplomacy Network in London. We organize climate events, climate change, and we believe that women are most affected by climate change. I know that the professor has been to Bangladesh, Helen, and in Bangladesh, in coastal areas, there's so much salinity, there's no fresh drinking water. And women and young girls have to walk like 10 miles sometimes, or 5 miles to get water. And our Prime Minister is building this, the entire coastal areas, we have 7 million solar home systems, and it's the highest in the world. So individual houses, she's encouraged people to take this, there's an ITCOL company, it's government owned, and they provide very subsidized price solar home systems for coastal areas which are cut off from the mainland. And they're also providing women with free deep tube wells so that they don't have to walk. And every girls' school is situated around those deep tube wells. So these are innovative things that we want to build our climate resilience against, but women's participation and women's voices are very important. Now, we need to look at COP28, how many women were there, and how many, all these health risks for women. When a cyclone happens, they're the ones, and they lose their household and poultry, and they're the ones who have to rebuild. So one issue that Bangladesh has brought in COP28 and will continue to at COP26 is that the mental health impact of climate change and the natural disasters. So mental health, when people lose their homes, the entire homes are just washed away. And when there's a flood, they lose everything, they actually break down mentally. So, loss and damage should include that mental health impact of or aspect of climate change. So I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
That was so interesting. I could listen to you all evening. That was so interesting. I'll come back to you to ask a little bit about loss and damage, because the Mayor of Freetown, Yvonne, was talking about, oh, it's all well and good, the loss and damage, but who pays it, who gets it, and how much for each person and so on. So looking to the future, maybe you will have some solutions for us there. But you were put on the spot there a little bit, Zach, about the Commonwealth and what government are doing. So I wonder if you want to give us a sort of overview of how you see the outcomes for COP moving forward into those solutions, and as we've heard, that innovation.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'm going to try not to, because so many good things have already been said, but I'm going to start by saying thank you to Chris for inviting me and for all the great work you've done in Parliament. So I'm going to do a shortcut is that I agree with everything that was just said around finance, and I hope we have a chance to talk a little bit more about that. I don't think the numbers are huge, they're overwhelming, but there are practical steps that we can take if politicians decide to take them to close that gap. It is possible. We have all the tools we need. It's a matter of political will. So I hope we'll be able to come back to some of that in a second. But I want to focus on the penultimate point that Her Excellency made, and that was around nature-based solutions. Because COP is a flawed process. We know that. And we've heard a lot about that in the last few days. But it is the only process we have that can bring the world together. It's the only thing that gives us any hope of being able to move in tandem internationally, globally. One of the main flaws, I think, with the COP process, until recently, still today, but less so, is that it's been incredibly narrow. It focuses almost exclusively on carbon, on the energy transition, on clean tech. And the problem with that is that it misses the bulk of the story, which is nature. There is no net zero. There is no solution to climate change without nature. It doesn't matter how many solar panels you put up. It doesn't matter how much energy efficiency, how many barriers and how many wind turbines. If you lose the Congo, if you lose the Amazon, if you lose the forests of Indonesia, if you lose the mangroves, which have provided protection, as you've spoken beautifully about this in the past, I've heard you, we're finished. It's game over. You know, about a quarter of emissions, probably a third of emissions, come from bad land use. And the flip side is that healthy forests absorb a lot of CO2. So it is insane, I think, that nature has always been so distant and so remote, so ancillary to the main discussions in COP. We tried to change that in Glasgow. We brought nature into the heart of this discussion, but we had to focus it a bit, and we focused on forests and mangroves. Nature is obviously a lot more than forests and mangroves, and we secured a pledge that, if delivered, if honoured, would, I think there is enough there that we would see the end of deforestation and the beginning of a reversal by the end of this decade. But there's a big if there, because as with all these things, there's a huge gap between promise and delivery. And that's a point I'm going to come back to in a second. But we are today looking at a world that is being environmentally shredded. And I'm not going to depress the audience too much. You probably are aware of the figures, but just to put it in context, we're losing every single minute around 30 football pitches worth of forest. I mean, it is staggering. I've used that figure before, and sometimes I find myself saying it without really thinking about it. But if you stop and actually consider what that means, it is devastating. We've lost around 2/3 of the world's wetlands. When I say lost, they're degraded to the point of not being able to provide the function that they're supposed to provide. 15 of the world's 17 great fisheries have either been brought, killed off, they've become dead zones, or they're on the brink of collapse. And it just goes on and on and on. And there is a simple truth, and that is that we do not exist except as part of the global environment. We see the end of the global environment, we see deterioration of key ecological systems on which each and every one of us depend. These discussions about carbon become completely absurd. So my concern is that as we go forward, and I say this taking advantage of the fact that we've got the next COP president, maybe the next COP president, certainly a representative of the next host of COP, is that we need to make nature front and center of this COP, next COP, and every subsequent COP. We cannot divide these issues up any further. The good news is that in terms of the energy transition, there is an inevitability about it. Whatever politicians do, we are going to go through this transition. We are going to end up with clean tech. We are going to have cars that are electric. They may not be cheap enough yet, but they were a lot cheaper now than they were 5 years ago, and a lot more efficient too. You know, today in every country in Africa, solar panels are the cheapest form of energy without any subsidies at all. I couldn't have said that to you 4 years ago. We were told in the UK that offshore wind we'd have to wait till 2043 was the official number in bays, or whatever bays used to be called, before it hit parity. It required no subsidies. In fact, we're at that point right now. Chris will have the best figures, but I think it's this year or next year. Technology's defied every single prediction, every single expectation. Even under President Trump, who spent billions of public money, taxpayers' money, trying to prop up the coal sector, weirdly, coal's nevertheless declined faster and further on his watch than it had under Obama. So we think we're all powerful politicians. The reality is the market is way more powerful than anything politicians come up with. But none of that is true when it comes to nature. So that's why we need government intervention to turn the tide, to help begin the process of reconciling ourselves with the natural world. And if you consider that only a tiny percent of funding, of aid money or philanthropic money goes towards dealing with climate change, only about 2% of that money goes towards nature. It really doesn't make any sense at all. And it's not just about climate change. Congo Basin, which we were losing at about 1 million hectares every year. Just imagine the consequences if those trends are allowed to continue. When we know that the Congo Basin, that one basin, provides more than half of all the rainfall across the entire continent of Africa. So you imagine the humanitarian disaster that is inevitable if we don't stop those trends from happening. That's the Congo Basin. Similar story in relation to the Amazon, similar story in relation to the forests of Indonesia, and so on and so forth. So this has to be the priority. And the final point I'll make is that we actually have all the promises that we need. If every promise that's been made in successive COPs, including the biodiversity COPs, was honoured, we'd be okay. We'd be having a very different discussion on this panel to the one we're having at the moment. And we have all the international apparatus. We had Paris, the big overarching goal. We had Glasgow, the Glasgow Leaders Declaration, which brought nature in. We had Montreal last year with the Global Biodiversity Framework, which sets the world theoretically on a path to recovery. About 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the world's land and sea by the end of this decade. You know, we've got commitment from the World Trade Organization to phase out harmful fisheries subsidies. We got commitments around, just a few days ago, around land use subsidies. All this stuff is there. But, you know, great, let's have more promises. That's wonderful, and I'm sure we'll get more promises in Azerbaijan as well. But way more important than more promises and more grandstanding by governments is we just bloody well do what we said we're already going to do. Because if we do, we'll be on a path to recovery. So that has to be the focus in my view. I realise I went all over the place and I didn't begin to answer your question. And I spoke for too long. I would love to speak more, but I'm going to stop and see where the discussion takes us.
And I think that challenge is the promises have to be delivered in something tangible. But it all feels a bit too big and maybe overwhelming, and sometimes that's where local leaders can come in.
Absolutely
So,
right.
for example, the commitment with the South Yorkshire Mayor, Oliver Coppard, for a white rose forest.
Yeah.
And where businesses and homes are being washed away in Hebden Bridge, we have initiatives for slow the flow, upstream water. So there are, I know sometimes it just feels so overwhelmingly massive, breaking it down into interventions that can be done now, today.
So I'm going to make one point, only because I think I spoke for a tiny bit less than my neighbour. So
did.
give me 20 seconds. Is that actually the good news is that every single thing that needs to be done is already being done. There's nothing, there's no gap. There's no area where we need to be managed. I'm looking at our friend from Costa Rica here. Costa Rica is an incredible example. They've broken the link between agricultural commodities and deforestation. Commodities are responsible for 80% of global deforestation. So if every country does what Costa Rica has done, we've got pretty much taken a bite out of the bulk of the deforestation problem. You've got Indonesia, broke the link between palm oil and deforestation. Very, very nearly broke the link at least. I mean, it's a way more successful story than I think they get credit for. You've got the Maldives. I think we have a representative here from the Maldives. Their tuna fishery is inherently sustainable. You can only use one line, one hook. More people are employed. When you buy tuna from the Maldives, you're part of the solution, not the problem. Gabon has broken the link between logging and deforestation. I didn't even think that was possible, but it is possible, just by banning the export of raw timber. So everything has to be processed and built in Gabon, which means you've got more highly skilled jobs, 10 times more people employed in logging, 10 times fewer trees being cut down. I've walked through forests that have been logged twice in Gabon. And I'm surrounded by forest gorillas and forest elephants and higher levels of biodiversity than I thought possible. It is possible, and that is true in every part of the world. There is a part of the solution. The difficulty is that it's not all happening under one umbrella in each and every country, and those examples of best practice are just that. They're not the norm. But we have everything we need to make them the norm. So it is very, very possible.
That's really hopeful. That's the focus of this session as well, is the future and solutions and how we can carry on the passion and the energy between COPs as well.
Yeah.
So that was quite a lot to take in, Helen. Do you want to just make a few comments about what you've heard so far?
Yeah, I'm glad that everyone else has rambled actually, because that gives me sort of license to,
You're allowed. Everyone is
to go
allowed
everywhere.
to ramble.
No, I really liked Zach's end on solutions, because I'm a big believer that there's more positive, there's more positive to get out of climate change than there is negative, and also the focus on doing, which I think fundamentally, basically there's you should always know where a stat comes from, shouldn't you? But there's a stat that I taught my students, which was that of the NDCs we have, only 44% of them actually have a plan associated with them. So for me, I 100% agree. It's about what we do with the plans we have, not new. Fine. Let's be more ambitious once we've done what we said we were going to do with the plans that we have. So I'm not a great believer in the UNFCCC as a process. I think it serves a purpose to bring everyone together. Do solutions to climate change have to be global? No, I don't think they do. And there's a lot of work about, in some senses, climate change means so many different things to so many different people that the solutions have to be local, they have to be embedded. Trying to get a global solution, in some sense, is holding us back. So they always have to carry on in tandem. You need all the countries of the world there speaking about this, but do you need a sort of universalist solution? Probably not, right? It's going to be localized, it's going to be based on our cultures and our priorities. So I think I'm a climate migration scholar, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about migration, because I think, funnily enough, the UNFCCC is a space where multilateral discussions. I've got a PhD student who works on this, so I'm stealing her ideas here, as we like to do as academics, just bask in the reflected glory of our PhD students. But, this idea that actually a lot of the multilateral work on climate-related migration is happening in the UNFCCC. Which is weird, right? It's not happening in the IOM. It's not happening. I mean, France is got the presidency of the Global Forum on Migration and Development at the moment. They're prioritizing climate, but actually, in the UNFCCC, there's a lot going on. But under this kind of area, we talk a lot about what needs to be done for net zero. We're not meeting our plans. We have to meet our NDCs. Everywhere there's a skills gap. So across the board, in every country of the world, there's a skills gap for net zero, and we're not talking about how we're going to fill that gap. We are, but we're probably not reacting on it. And we need to train up our own populations. We need to reskill our own populations. We need to have that pipeline of people coming through that can use this tech. But that's going to take too long, right? We need immigration, right? And again, this is a big part of transitioning to net zero we're not talking about, which is that we need different immigration systems, because countries UK cannot meet its net zero commitments without increased migration of skilled workers. We don't even have the visa systems required, because we don't know what those future jobs 100% are going to be, because we don't really know how this net zero, how this sector, this green sector, is going to explode. And so I think we really need to start talking about, we are talking about skills, but I think we need to start talking seriously about migration systems that allow us to meet the net zero challenge within our countries. And that's something I've sort of been thinking about quite a lot recently. I think something else that's come up with the whole of the last discussion about finance, and I've never argued that the governments can meet everything, and we have a discussion before the chat about the role of the private sector, that this funding has to come from the private sector. But the IPCC, I'm an IPCC author, I worked on Working Group 2 and this year and this round. And for the first time, the IPCC kind of recognized the role of colonial legacies in driving vulnerability. And so vulnerability, you're not going to reduce vulnerability in countries by countries giving a few $1 million here and a few $1 million there. It relates, as a colleague talked about, restructuring the kind of global financial system, restructuring, this idea of stopping debt when a disaster comes. Well, why not just stop the debt, So I think there's a limit to how much gifts from one country to another can actually reduce vulnerability in those countries, and I think we have to keep talking about that, as there needs to be a change in the way the whole of the global society is structured for us to be able to live well under climate change. And that was something that came out in the IPCC, the role of these historical legacies. One thing I will just talk about as a kind of thing I think we should be talking about more, which is about transboundary and cascading risks, I think, as well, which tie us together as countries. So, it's easy for us to think about adapting in our own countries, but not only are emissions transboundary, so is risk. And it's increasingly we're understanding how risk cascades across borders through our supply chains, through our interconnected economies. And so we can't really just focus on those countries needing to adapt and us not needing to adapt, because their risks are our risks. But also, even saying that, for example, the UK the adaptation gap is huge, and you think, actually, what do we need to see? Okay, maybe if we're not reducing emissions, fine, but let's take adaptation seriously, and let's start thinking about the solutions that we can put in place to adapt, because even the UK, which you might think is a more resilient country, isn't going to meet the challenge of climate change in terms of impacts. Our infrastructure, our people aren't ready. So I think it's about, I'm not sure what the point there is, readiness of our own countries, but also understanding that our risk is everybody else's risk, and we're increasingly understanding that. So I think, one more point I'll end on.
Sure.
One more point, someone else does.
Yeah, go
Zach
for
had
it.
an extra point. 1.5 degrees, I think as well, the focus on the line weirds me out a bit. It's an arbitrary line that we've made for dangerous climate change, which has a legacy around how we used to model climate change and how it became this political force. And I think it's something that we've rallied around, but every increment of a degree matters. And I think sometimes the focus on the 1.5 leads you think, we've exceeded it now, it's over. And it doesn't matter. If we can get to 1.51 or 1.52, that's better than, we don't cross that line, it's the end. And I think sometimes that obsession with the 1.5 line, I think, detracts from the fact that every fraction of a degree matters.
I think also your point about skills is really important, because as a local leader, having responsibility for adult education budget, 65 million, one of my manifesto pledges was 1,000 green jobs for young people, and set up a green jobs task force. We're over 1,107, which is pleasing, but also I've got to get buy-in from potentially a new government. And so the Labour government are talking about 28 billion for their Green New Deal. My argument would be, well, then if we are going to level up and also tackle the climate emergency, then spend that money in areas that are historically manufacturing, but also it's an opportunity for skills training and well-paid jobs and just transition. So I do think that is a particularly important point, that we will never be able to get there without that knowledge transfer and that skill. So just building on what we were saying about the future and something that Zach was really offering, which is solutions. And this is an exam question for everyone, what do we think might be, or what would we hope would be the breakthrough when we get to Azerbaijan? Maybe I will start with you.
I will
Okay,
ask my
all right.
co-host
So
to
while
go
everybody
first.
thinks about the exam question and the answer, what would be the hope? We have all so many ambitions. We've seen, haven't we, that this time that the phasing out of fossil fuels has been seen as very positive, whilst not going far enough. Has been a celebratory moment for some. And a step in the right direction. Have you any thoughts of what you would think, it would be a great COP if we could just get this?
So I'm going to, as we heard from His Excellency, that when you've got the whole world having to agree something, you're always going to have something which is suboptimal. That is just a fact of COP. But some of the really good things that happen at COP don't necessarily happen in the big forums. So I'm guaranteeing that 90% of the audience did not hear that a few days ago in COP in Dubai, all of the countries of the South Pacific, all the small island states in the Pacific, bar one, signed up to a commitment, to protect an area of ocean connected that is bigger than the surface area of the moon. Now, how many people knew that?
Wow.
Look at no hands going up at all. I mean, where the hell were our useless newspapers? Where was the BBC? Where was Sky? Where were any of these bloody... I don't know how many journalists there are here, but if you're a journalist here interested in climate change, why did you not write about that? How many people would have been enthused and happy to hear that this great thing had been agreed with money? real political commitment and money. And that's just one example. So I would like to see, I'd like to see our bloody newspapers and journalists actually talking about, not just looking for the petty dramas and squabbling, but actually telling the truth, telling the stories, giving those young people who are so depressed, rightly so by where we are, that there are some good things happening. Let's celebrate them, for God's sake. A lot of work went into creating that thing. Not one line in the British press, not one bloody line. Maybe in other countries they're a bit more interested, but I don't think so. And there are other examples like that as well. What I would like to see between now and Azerbaijan is I would like to see something similar agreed around the great basins, the great biomes, the Congo, the Amazon, Indonesia. Political appetite is there. We've had some helpful elections like President Lula in Brazil. There's an election coming up in Indonesia, but it looks like it's going to be a continuity of some sort, and the current minister's really ambitious for their forests. In the Congo, different countries, but coming together with something that looks like a consensus there. I would love to see big, grand coalitions of country, donor country, philanthropists, private sector coming together to help provide a solution to some of these gigantic problems. That would be pretty good. I'd love to see more buy-in for things like the mangrove breakthrough, which you're part of. Bangladesh has been so good, by the way, on this. And your personal leadership has been superb. I would actually like to see us crack the nut that you challenged us with earlier around finance. You know, we talk about 700 billion needed for nature recovery, but we're not going to come up, governments aren't going to provide 700 billion. But if you consider that the top 50 food-producing countries in the world spend $500 to $700 billion every single year subsidizing often destructive land use, imagine the impact if you shifted away from destruction towards renewal. You'd have closed that gap there and then with just one policy. I know it's not that simple, but there are countries doing it, actually. It's one area where I think the UK is showing leadership. We are transforming our land use subsidy system. So there are many ways we can do this. Debt, I totally agree with you on the debt issue, but there are some interesting things happening with debt. Ecuador, our friend Gustavo Manrique from Ecuador restructured a part of Ecuador's debt and effectively created a $1.4 billion endowment out of nothing, just by lowering the cost of the debt, a part of the debt Ecuador had working with America. No new money introduced, didn't cost anything. $1.4 billion endowment, which is now paying for the conservation promises of the last Ecuador government. Belize has done something very similar. Seychelles have got their blue bond. Fiji have got their blue bond. There are some really interesting things happening out there. It feels to me that if we could get the big multilateral development banks, which are moving but at a glacial pace into the right place, we will start freeing up a lot more of the finance that we currently need. At the moment, then they have to be pushed and pushed and pushed. I know this from Glasgow. You are soon going to discover this. Moving the MDBs is very, very difficult, but they need to be moved, and they need to create much easier access to finance, particularly for the climate vulnerable nations, but also for some of these more innovative solutions.
What's the carrot then on their finance?
Well, on the MDBs, I think it's us. I think we are one of the biggest investors in the multilateral system. We are therefore a shareholder. We could have a much more muscular approach. This is something I was always saying when I was a minister in government. I wish the UK were more muscular. We shouldn't just tell the World Bank we're going to pay every year, whatever, no conditions attached. We should make our contributions conditional. If you're not going to open up finance to the small island states that we are friends of and meant to be supporting in the Pacific region, or half of the Commonwealth countries as climate vulnerable nations, we're going to at least reduce our contributions to the World Bank. If France and Germany and Norway and other countries did the same thing, those multilateral development banks can respond. We know they can respond. The Global Environment Fund came under a lot of criticism 3 years ago for being too bureaucratic, too slow, too difficult. A country would ask for money and it would take 5 years, and by then the need had gone. They are now the most responsive and the most agile. I always come back to Costa Rica, but it's our friend Carlos Manuel, former environment minister from Costa Rica, was put in charge of the GEF. He has transformed it. It now looks like an agile multilateral development institution which provides money very quickly to the front line, to the best organizations. If other multilateral organizations behaved in a similar manner, again, we'd be having a different discussion now. So this is not rocket science. We know you don't have to be imaginative, even or clever. You just take the stuff that works and roll it out.
That's definitely something for the agenda moving forward.
Sorry,
And
it's
it's fine.
long
No,
answer.
it's very good. You're passing to each other, His Excellency.
I'm glad that I yielded some more time to Lord Goldschmidt. I think it's a very positive agenda. I think, of course, as we all know, the issue of financing and finding the ways to support the action. If we can, I don't know if we can resolve it in Azerbaijan. I think it's probably more for Brazil to finalize it, to put the seal. But if we can make a meaningful progress in Azerbaijan towards this, I think that's very important. And there's something Lord Goldschmidt spoke about, and made me think about this, and we will be trying to work on this, is to put, I think, two things front, and which is very important for us. One is, of course, the issue of nature itself, because Azerbaijan is a very diverse, it's a very small place, but it's very diverse. We have 9 out of 11 possible climate zones. They all mingled and intermingled, so it's very important for us. But also the success stories. You spoke about Costa Rica, you spoke about Indonesia, Mauritius, you spoke about Gabon, and I think one thing which is missing is that we don't showcase them enough. Yeah. I think because people, look, there is a certain mentality around the world. If people come in and they look like Americans did that and the British did it, they're like, okay, can we do it? But if they see that it's been done in Indonesia, it's been done in Costa Rica, it's been done in Gabon, they say, well, we can do it too. Why don't we try to do that? And I think highlighting those successes, I think we'll try to do this. I think that would be a very good approach. And for us, for instance, one thing we're kind of careful to talk about because it requires us a regional partnership as well. It's a shrinking nature of the Caspian Sea. I mean, Caspian Sea is a unique body of water. It produces the only real caviar. Most of the caviar which you eat is not real because it doesn't come from the Caspian. But you know, but the population is decreasing and the water is shrinking. So I think it would require us to have a regional partnership, regional action, because the 5 nations which border the sea. But also we understand how important and as you said, whatever you do in terms of carbon, once the sea goes away, we have the opposite problem with you. Your Excellency, you have, our water goes to you, I guess. I mean, we're losing water. So I think this is something we need to look at. Her Excellency mentioned something that we need a regional approach, and I think and the partnerships. I think that's very important because, as the professor pointed out, I mean, you can't control where the wind goes, where the pollution goes. And for us, I think the very fact that the nations of Eastern and Central Europe supported Azerbaijan's candidacy, it was also, we understand and we appreciate, with a certain hope and putting a responsibility on us to act and speak for all of them, not just for Azerbaijan, not just for big issues, but for our neighbors and for our region. And that's partly reflected in our agreement and understanding with Armenia that we also want them to live in a cleaner world. I think that's also important. And I want to join something that Ambassador said here. I think we need to look at a global complex issue. It's a more peaceful world, a greener world, but also a more equal world. I think the issue of immeasurably more greater damage done by environmental pollution and degradation onto women and to vulnerable groups in general should be taken into account, because we often don't look at it in the way we should be looking at. And I think you're absolutely right. I think we should also look at this to bring the issue of equality within that conversation as well, because without that, a clean world which is not equal, I mean, it's good but not good enough.
Indeed, indeed. I've just caught the time. I can't believe the time has rattled away with us. And I do want to get a couple of questions from the very distinguished audience. So I wonder if we could just very quickly answer the exam question about what we hope to see for next COP, and then I will open it up to the audience. I wonder, Helen, would you want to kick us off?
I can try and keep it short. I think I want to come back to something actually that Vijay said in the last panel. He didn't call it climate resilient development pathways, but that's what we would call it under the IPCC, which is pathways that link adaptation and mitigation together. And I think they're in 2 separate camps, and they're not joined enough. There's no point building new infrastructure for the net zero transition if it's not climate resilient, right? There's no point doing adaptation if you're not thinking about, okay, is this increasing emissions or lowering emissions? So I think a bringing together of the adaptation and mitigation agendas, because when you're making a decision on the ground, they're not separate, are they? If you're investing in a piece of infrastructure or you're investing in agriculture or whatever. So I think that would be something. I think, going back to what Zach was saying about the media, I often think about the fact that there's so many businesses going to COP, and often it's presented as a kind of greenwashing thing, right? Mm-hmm. But it's actually a great thing that all these businesses are going to COP, because they want to know how to, they're involved. I want to know how to do this. And so I suppose, how do we allow stop having these two COPs. You know, there's the COP of the negotiations and then there's the COP of the big jamboree, and can they be brought together somehow? Or do you know what I mean? And then how can we use, I don't know, maybe make more of the jamboree in a sense for the businesses that are there. And I think finally, something I often write about is this, the climate change is an opportunity thing that's come up, and how, again, people who are skeptical and cynical are like, well, that's a greenwashing thing, you're just business as usual with a bit of good in it. But fundamentally, some of these things are really shifting things for the better in society, not just with climate change. And how do you keep giving people that hope rather than that fear, I think. And actually, to come back to your point about the climate anxiety, you know, which is there, which is real, which is... So, you know, I think, yes, how do we keep building on a solutions focus without it being business as usual and greenwashing?
So business welcome. That's a really good point. Thank you. Yes, Ambassador.
Thank you. You know, first of all, I'd like to remind everyone, Bangladesh is hosting 1.1 million Rohingya refugees, which has gone to 1.3 now. And this, you know, not only climatically displaced people, but refugees coming from, and they settled, you know, we had to rehabilitate them in Cox's Bazar. That is the most climatically vulnerable region for Bangladesh. And there comes that, you know, this, you talked about climate migrants, I'm talking about climate refugees and other refugees. So, you know, at the COP28, Bangladesh's negotiator, our Prime Minister has appointed Special Envoy Sabit Jordi, and he mentioned about CBRD and CP. The question of equity is very important. When LDCs were talking about CBRD and CP to be kept in the adaptation or the loss and damage, the developed countries were fighting it. So, you know, at the end of the day, climate change is an opportunity, and it shouldn't be a zero-sum game. What you're investing today is going to pay back in the future. So in terms of, you know, I want to mention that at the sidelines of the COP29, we'd like to see an ESG and talk about private sector. Just yesterday, we organized at the Parliament, you know, Bangladesh is the second largest ready-made garment producer. And our apparel industry is transforming to an ESG regime. And where, you know, where the British consumers, we had Marks & Spencer, Primark, New Look, and other British fashion, you know, retailers there, and everybody is working on sustainable cotton, sustainable recycling, you know, less energy efficiency, having more solar on the factory. So I think private sector's ESG should be a focus of the COP29. And if you could organize an ESG day to show the private sector should be showcasing, you know, there should be a competition created within them to show their ESG. Therefore, you know, automatically they'll focus on cutting down emissions. The other one is, you know, Zach, thanks for mentioning mangrove. At the COP28, there was a global mangrove alliance that was created, and we congratulate UE for doing that. And mangrove is something, you know, it's a carbon sink. Not only does it make coastal resilience, but it also is the largest carbon sink for Bangladesh and India. And we are the largest delta in the world, and we are the foothills of the Himalayas. So, you know, speaking of ecosystems and conserving ecosystems, the largest delta should be also the Bay of Bengal. And here I want to talk about leadership. You know, leadership is very important. Which leader and which presidents and prime ministers are focusing and giving top priority to climate change? And here I want to commend Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. She came up at COP21 during our CVF. All the countries in the CVF have adopted a climate prosperity partnership. That means the Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan. We are talking about transforming our vulnerability to resilience, transferring our resilience to prosperity. Bangladesh has been the highest growth country in South Asia for the last nearly, you know, a decade. And to sustain a high growth rate with climate prosperity is the challenge. And that is where we need to invest. So we want to see a climate prosperity concept. So when we were chair of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, we encouraged every CVF member to adopt a climate prosperity plan. That means how you can sustain your growth rate, yet not compromise on climate. It's a very difficult balancing act, but you have to try to do it. And nature-based solutions is very important for that. And therefore, in COP28 or COP29 or COP30, we'd like to see showcasing of what countries are doing. So we should be having an climate innovation day, climate resilience innovation day, where we showcase what we are doing. It can be a good way of learning from each other and also South-South cooperation. And one more point I would like to make, you know, quite often developed countries who have been the biggest polluters, they think they're doing us a charity. Now I want to look at my SIDS friends. You're doing us no charity. You've actually polluted the world and caused us not to exist. So, you know, in terms of the least they can do is, you know, I talked about the Santiago Network, which is going to be, you know, housed at the UNDRR, at the UN. The Santiago network is working on technical capacity building to discuss even loss and damage. People don't understand that what losses, I'm talking about the common people, the agricultural, the farmers, the people who are dealing with Sundarbans, for example, the honey collectors of Sundarbans. They need to be told that there is a way you can enhance your skills. And this is what I'm saying. If you're talking about green skills, how to actually operate, utilize the loss and damage fund, people need skills on that. So in COP29, we'd like to see, now that we have a loss and damage fund, and a mechanism for access to fund, we'd like to see the Santiago network given much more important and working with the loss and damage fund, perhaps the World Bank, but no one agreed with it. Everybody thought it should go to the Caribbean Bank of Development. That should be the headquarters of the, the loss and damage fund. But it is the World Bank, and we have to decide how do we actually build skills amongst our people. We can enable our scientists to decide how to utilize the loss and damage fund. So there are funds, but also utilization is very important. One more thing I'd like to mention is 2 cases that are going on. Bangladesh will continue to see climate justice to be a very important issue. I know the developed countries, they always get scared, when we talk about funds and financing. But at the same time, there are 2 cases that submitted, one by the Small States Commission at the ITLOS, where we are asking the UNCLOS Convention's application on whether it is legal for developed countries to just pollute and cause the sea level to rise, and whether it is legal to do so. And the other case has been submitted by Bangladesh and Vanuatu at the International Court of Justice, where, again, we want to see the application of international law on climate change and global sea level rise, whether a country or a group of countries can cause other group of countries to go underwater. So climate justice and the morality of it is extremely important. So we have to apply ethics, and we'd like to see something at COP29 so we can take leadership on that. And last
Her
is...
Excellency, I'm so sorry. I have been given the signal that I know that people are wanting to...
Sorry about that.
It's all right. This is so interesting. People are wanting to circulate and to chat as well. And I have been a terrible host because I've let the time run away with us. But it's been so interesting. And ending on climate justice, I think, is a very good end and something maybe to take away as we look forward to the next COP. Thank you all so much for attending and for being such a great audience and showing such interest. It's been fantastic and fascinating, and thank you all so much. And there's obviously opportunity for chatting later. Thank you.
I'd like to also say thank you again to the panel for remarkable discussions and fascinating insights. I'm sure you'll all agree. We're now going to move through to the next room, where we're going to have an evening reception. I'm delighted that we're going to be joined by the Shadow Secretary of State for Net Zero and Energy Security, the Right Honourable Miliband, who will give another keynote address. And I understand that there are some sort of remarkable views of the capital out on the outdoor terrace as well. This day actually marks a year to the day where I submitted the Net Zero review to the UK government, which then sort of inspired the Mission Zero sort of coalition. That review is available for anyone to take away at the back, so do please pick up your copy. This has been a fantastic opportunity to reflect on the outcomes of COP28, to discuss the priorities for COP29 and COP30. And for me personally, one of the key recommendations in the global stocktake text was actually a Mission 1.5 degrees framework that all 3 presidencies are now going to work on. And if any of the countries here are inspired to go away and think about your future national return and contributions, any help that we can give either at KCL or the Mission Zero Coalition, we're keen to do so to help provide that opportunity to recognise that climate change and action on climate is both an opportunity as well as obviously a moment to address the climate crisis. So look forward for everyone to come through to the room. Please do pick up a drink on your way and also a copy of the Mission Zero book if you haven't already. And look forward to the keynote address that will begin around 6:30. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you. We look forward to seeing you in Azerbaijan. Yes.
It's great to see you here.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.